The saga of French Louisiana begins not with an intrepid journey, but with a lie. A vast and irresistible lie whispered across the salons and counting houses of 18th century Paris. At the turn of the century, the newspapers and promoters of the French crown painted a picture of a promised land, a tropical Eden waiting to be claimed along the great Mississippi River. They spoke of Louisiana with a language of boundless optimism, describing lush, untamed forests, soils rich enough to produce endless harvests of tobacco and indigo, and a navigable river system that promised to funnel unimaginable wealth directly back to the mother country. The propaganda was deliberate, designed to mask a harsh reality that threatened to bankrupt the nation. France, under the newly established Regency of Philip II, Duke of Orleans, was financially ruined by the long, costly wars of King Louis XIV. The national debt was catastrophic, crippling the economy and plunging the aristocracy into a panic. To save the crown, a solution was desperately needed, and it had to be a miracle.
This desperate search for a financial savior led the regent to place his complete trust in arguably the most unlikely figure in French history, a man whose past was as checkered as his monetary theories were dazzling: John Law. Law was a high-stakes Scottish gambler, a convicted killer who had fled Britain after a fatal duel, an outcast who drifted across Europe, sustaining himself not through an inheritance, but through his astonishing acumen at the card table and his radical ideas about banking. Law believed that hard currency, like gold and silver, was a stifling relic of the past. The true key to economic freedom was paper money, backed by the wealth of the nation, or in this case, the promise of colonial wealth. He was not just a genius of finance, he was a captivating salesman, possessing an almost hypnotic ability to persuade the powerful of his vision. How could a regent, facing the collapse of his empire's finances, entrust the fate of France to a man who literally had blood on his hands and lived by chance? This question underscores the sheer desperation that gripped Paris.
In 1717, Law was granted permission to form the Company of the West, a massive joint stock company granted control over the entire Louisiana territory. This company was the vessel for his grand experiment. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would sell shares in this colonial venture, promising investors a piece of the future paradise in America. The money raised from the share sales would then be loaned to the French government, effectively paying down the crippling national debt. Investors, in turn, would profit handsomely as the colony began exporting valuable raw materials like tobacco and sugar. Law's financial institution, the Banque Générale, was already successfully issuing paper currency, and its connection to this new colonial venture gave the entire enterprise a deceptive, rock-solid appearance. What began as a financial rescue quickly mutated into something entirely new: the Mississippi Bubble, one of the world's first true speculative manias. The effect on French society was immediate and intoxicating. The value of the shares, fueled by the regent's explicit backing and Law's relentless promotion, began an exponential and utterly illogical climb. Rich families, desperate for easy money to replace their lost wartime fortunes, poured capital into the venture. Middle-class citizens, soldiers, and even servants rushed to join the frenzy. The excitement centralized on the Rue Quincampoix, a narrow Parisian street that became the world's first dedicated stock market, buzzing 24 hours a day with frenetic energy. People were literally selling their homes, their jewelry, and their carriages just to buy more shares, convinced they were securing a fortune that would last for generations. John Law, the fugitive gambler, became the most powerful man in France, his carriage trailed by nobles begging for an audience. But if the entire French economy was now betting on Louisiana, what was actually happening in the Promised Land itself? The tragic irony was that while shares soared to the heavens in Paris, the reality on the ground in Louisiana remained stubbornly earthly. The outpost of New Orleans, established in 1718, was a swampy disaster. It was a handful of crude wooden huts surrounded by endless wilderness, a breeding ground for mosquitoes and tropical diseases. The climate was harsh, the indigenous tribes were often hostile, and the initial attempts at farming were failures. Crucially, the colony had almost no productive output, meaning the shares being traded for astronomical prices were, quite literally, backed by nothing but mud and fever dreams. The colony urgently required actual, hard-working settlers, farmers, artisans, and laborers to transform the paper promise into tangible wealth. Law and the Crown initially tried to maintain the fiction of the New Eden, continuing to solicit volunteers with offers of free land and huge profits. But the truth was impossible to suppress. Letters and reports detailing the pestilence, starvation, and grueling conditions were trickling back to Europe. The rumors of misery were so pervasive that virtually no one volunteered. Faced with the collapse of the entire Mississippi enterprise, and therefore the collapse of the French economy, the regent made a terrifying, chilling decision. If people would not go to Louisiana willingly, they would be sent by force. And this desperation led to a catastrophic moral failing that would scar the history of the colony forever. By the end of 1718, the era of polite solicitation ended, replaced by an organized campaign of state-sponsored kidnapping. Police patrols, known colloquially as the bandoliers, began sweeping through Paris and other major French ports. The patrol's mandate was chillingly vague: arrest any individual who could not prove legitimate employment or residency. This was not a nuanced legal effort. It was a ruthless dragnet that targeted the homeless, beggars, petty criminals, minor offenders who had committed crimes like salt smuggling, vagrants, and abandoned orphans. Entire groups of the unwanted and the impoverished were shackled together and marched to the Atlantic ports, loaded onto crowded ships, and sent across the ocean against their will. In January 1719, a royal decree officially formalized this cruelty, transforming Louisiana from a hopeful venture into a horrific penal colony, a dumping ground for the dregs of French society. But within this wave of forced male deportations, an even more specific and tragic misery was directed toward a singular group: women. The colony's demographics were wildly unbalanced, with men outnumbering women by a factor of 10 to 1. Colonial officials, desperately trying to instill some semblance of social stability and morality, argued that the colony could not be productive or permanent without family units and wives. Their solution, however, was not based on finding suitable partners, but on rounding up women considered socially expendable for export. What kind of women were judged fit to found a new society, and yet deemed worthless by the one they were leaving? The criteria for selection were appalling. Officials targeted women who had been under police supervision for any reason, whether they were prostitutes, petty offenders, or simply young women who lacked the protection of a family or a male guardian. John Law himself is documented to have visited the Salpêtrière, a vast, frightening Parisian institution that served as a workhouse, hospital, and prison for poor, orphaned, or socially undesirable women. From this place of institutional despair, he selected a group, justifying their transport with the official, cynical description of them being of good character. The reality was that these women, many of whom had committed no serious crime beyond poverty, were given no choice in their destiny. They were simply informed that they were to be married and shipped across the Atlantic to stabilize the savage lands of Louisiana. The apex of this institutionalized cruelty occurred during the mass wedding ceremonies. The women were paired, sight unseen, with the male convicts already scheduled for deportation, future husbands they had never met and certainly never chosen. The spectacle was utterly dehumanizing. 184 couples were married in a single, colossal event, bound by decree and state necessity rather than love or consent. Once the vows were forced upon them, the couples were immediately chained together for the long march to the coast.
The procession itself became a source of dark amusement for the Parisian populace. Crowds lined the streets to watch the parade of the chained couples, a morbid, surreal circus. Contemporary accounts paint a stark picture. Some women were said to have worn yellow ribbons, a grim joke about their forced future. Others reportedly sang defiant songs, while many more wept openly, crying out to priests or lost lovers as the procession passed. The entire episode fueled a cruel, widely sung ditty in the streets. There are no prostitutes left in Paris, they've all gone to Mississippi. The transatlantic voyage was a final, grueling ordeal. The ship carrying many of these unwilling founders was ominously named Le Mutin, the mutinous one, a title fitting for a journey filled with sickness, starvation, and desperation. Crammed into unhygienic holds, many women and convicts died en route. Some of the women, in acts of breathtaking courage, attempted to escape once they reached a stopover, but most were recaptured. Those who survived the crossing arrived in the humid, pestilential outposts of Louisiana, barely able to stand. After enduring such a calculated campaign of abuse and humiliation, what was left of their morale, and what future could they possibly build?
The social fabric of the colony immediately disintegrated. The vast demographic imbalance persisted, with 10 men for every woman in some areas, creating enormous, violent tensions. In desperate outposts, when multiple men desired to marry the same woman, the officers in charge settled the matter by resorting to gambling, literally throwing dice to determine a woman's husband. The forced marriages collapsed within weeks. Many were plagued by violence, and women who lacked any form of social or economic protection quickly resorted to the very trade they had been accused of in France, prostitution, simply to avoid starvation and survive the harsh conditions. The French authorities' lofty goal of imposing a moral, orderly society on the frontier dissolved into the swampy reality almost immediately. The dream was bankrupt, and the moral order was shattered. While the colonial experiment stagnated in the brutal heat of the New World, the spectacular financial fantasy back in Paris was nearing its climax. Law's system required endless growth and continuous cash infusion, but the stock was now trading at a value far beyond anything the actual colony could ever produce. People had leveraged everything, quit their jobs, and lived entirely on paper wealth. Tales of the mania were absurd. One nobleman, convinced he was a millionaire, reportedly ran naked through the streets in sheer ecstasy. The fever dream, however, could not last. As doubts began to creep into the market, the government attempted a desperate, ill-fated intervention. In May 1720, the French regent authorized a decree that officially halved the value of the Mississippi Company's stock overnight. The effect was not calming, but catastrophic. Panic struck Paris like a lightning bolt. Investors realized their paper fortunes were fictional. Mobs of ruined speculators, from nobles to commoners, besieged Law's offices on the Rue Quincampoix. Riots broke out. Fortunes vanished in minutes. People were trampled to death in the stampede to exchange paper notes for any scrap of metal currency. The entire financial system of France imploded into chaos and immediate, devastating bankruptcy. John Law, the once revered financial messiah, became the most hated man in Europe. He fled France in disguise, his own catastrophic flight providing a final, bitterly ironic twist to his story. In the wake of this disaster, the policy of forced deportation stopped instantly. There were no more police sweeps, no more mass arrests, no more chained couples marching to the ships. France quietly abandoned the entire system, burying the shame of the Mississippi bubble deep beneath the weight of economic depression and hoping that the public would simply forget the massive, cruel folly. But can a society ever truly erase the memory of a profound state-sponsored atrocity? Memory, as it turns out, is far more resilient than paper money. A decade later, in 1731, the story of the exiled women was immortalized, if heavily romanticized, in the Abbé Prévost's novel Manon Lescaut.
The book transformed the tragic experience into a famous, passionate romance set in New Orleans. Though it was banned by French authorities for being dangerously immoral, it was secretly devoured by the public, ensuring that the historical truth, however distorted, survived. But the most compelling and truest testimony came not from fiction, but from the women who actually endured the nightmare. Their stories were harsher, quieter, and infinitely more powerful. They were the ones who refused to be defined by the crimes committed against them. Marie Baron, who arrived as a simple deportee, became one of the earliest, most successful independent landowners in the fledgling colony of New Orleans. Françoise Renault, against all odds, established a highly successful trading post along the riverbanks, creating a commerce link essential for the colony's survival. And Marguerite Simonette became a crucial midwife, helping to deliver and nurture a generation of children into the very world she had been forced to enter.
These 3 women, and countless others like them, had been officially judged expendable back in the courts and institutions of France. Yet, they became the ultimate, unwitting founders of the colony. They survived the fever, the famine, the forced marriages, and the chaos. It was their sheer, obstinate human endurance, not the grand designs of kings, generals, or financial speculators, that stabilized Louisiana. The colony that France advertised as a grand paradise, the colony they populated through kidnapping, forced matrimony, and reckless financial gambling, only survived because the very people they intended to throw away simply refused to break. They were not the adventurers who sought opportunity, they were the condemned, the forgotten, the unwanted. And yet, they built something real. Not a gleaming, instant New Eden, but a fragile human foothold at the edge of a great swamp. And through that fierce, unyielding resilience, the foundation of New Orleans was laid. This is how a city is born, not by gold or glory, but by the desperate will of those who have lost everything but the determination to live. The saga of French Louisiana remains a profound, cautionary tale of how the most magnificent financial fantasy can collapse into moral ruin, and yet how the most basic human resilience can still triumph over the calculated cruelty of empire. We hope this animated historical deep dive captured your attention and shed new light on a forgotten tragedy. This compelling history is based on extensive research from respected historians, with references provided on screen for those who wish to explore the primary sources further. If you found this examination of Louisiana's reluctant founders engaging, please support our mission by liking this video, sharing it with a fellow history enthusiast, and leaving a comment below. Your support is crucial to bringing these complex stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in our series on the history of the American continent.